Welcome, everyone. Thanks. There's a few people still getting food, and we'll have them settle in and all of that. But in the interest of time, I thought we'd get started. First of all, wow, I'm just super impressed at the turnout today. This is fantastic. I'm so glad you're all here, interested in this very important topic. Thank you. I think you will be happy that you took the time to be here. Just a couple of quick thank yous. First of all, I just want to do a shout out to Rich Portnoy, who is my boss, but also is the person who really pushed for this workshop to come to the Institute and had a lot of vision for this project. So thanks to him, and thank you for to the GSC, the Gender and Sexuality Center for Queer and Trans Life, which is putting on this workshop for us. We're hoping, and I've heard a lot of feedback already from people that they're really excited about this topic, and they're thankful that we're bringing it onto you. And we're hoping that this will be the first in a series of workshops on issues of diversity, inclusion, and equity. So I'm hoping that I didn't have time to work up any sort of survey or feedback or anything like that, but please just email me your thoughts, suggestions for future topics, anything like that after today's workshop. What else do I have to say? I think before I get going, I just want to introduce our two speakers today. Today we have Melinda Lee, who's the Assistant Director at the GSC, originally from Long Beach, California. They're here studying public policy at the Humphrey School. And alongside them, we have Saumya Arora, who is the Student Education and Tongues Untied Coordinator at the GSC. And she will be graduating this semester, so off to bigger and better things. So thank you for being here.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone. Shout out again to Rich for encouraging this to happen, and also to Maya. It's really awesome to see departments interested in learning about how to be responsive to trans and gender nonconforming people. Again, my name is Melinda Lee. I go by they, them pronouns. And I share my pronouns because you can't necessarily tell what pronouns someone uses just by looking at them. That's the foundational assumption within the queer and trans community. So it's always good to ask and self-disclose if you want. So.
And again, I'm Saumya Arora, and like I said earlier, I use she, her pronouns, and I'm also the Student Education and Tongues Untied Coordinator.
Oh, we have a clicker.
Yeah.
We're going to indulge.
Yeah. All right, so what does it mean to create equity for trans and gender nonconforming staff and visitors at your center? So one of the biggest things is modeling respect. I know a lot of times people ask, like, why is it important that we put, this list of identities? And I think a lot of it is respect, like maintaining that you care about people and that you want to, acknowledge that their identities are valid. Creating a comfortable environment to engage with one another, and then incorporating practices that acknowledge the existence of trans and gender nonconforming people or approaches problems by taking into account the political, social, and cultural worlds in which they emerge. And I also, if you have questions at any time, please feel free to ask, jump in whenever. You don't need to wait till the end, because this is kind of a working process and we want to make sure we're addressing everything.
Yeah. I at least know for myself that sometimes I can use words that I think that everyone knows. And also because, in the conversations that I have, it can sometimes be an echo chamber, so I'm just saying things and then I assume that people know. So please feel free to interject with a question out loud or raise your hand, whatever is comfortable for you. And then we'll also have space at the end, too, to ask questions. So I guess to start, maybe we can do a little bit of back and forth about what are some of the ways that you think that your department practices inclusivity. And it doesn't necessarily have to be around gender or sexuality, but maybe someone can share something, or is this the worst place ever?
When we make gift quilts, we invite all people, regardless of their gender identity.
Okay, awesome. Yep.
I know some people put their preferred pronoun in their SIG, in their emails,
Okay.
which is helpful if, for example, if phrase they, and I wouldn't necessarily guess that. And, it's something that I hadn't really thought about doing until I saw others doing it, and now maybe I should start doing it, or I should think about doing it more.
Totally, yeah. As a trans person, it is helpful for me to see that in other people's email signatures, because it's almost a signal to me that that person at least has some level of consciousness or education around how those things can't be assumed. So,
Click. All right, so just a little primer on terms and language. There's so many terms in the community and they're constantly changing, so I think it's really important to keep that in mind, that what you may use now will change in the future most likely, and especially young people tend to kind of come up with words that they feel better fit their identity. So just, if you are wondering, you can always ask somebody what these things mean. So we have a couple up here, so queer, trans, asexual, pansexual, gender nonconforming, gay, which I feel like is the most common one. But are any of these words like unfamiliar to you, or are there any words you're wondering about that you want to ask about? Yeah.
Well, in this context, all of them, actually, I mean, I may be the oldest person in the room, but these meanings have shifted over time, and, I'm not sure what they mean to your generation.
Yeah. So I think we can both kind of talk a little bit about this, but I think for me, queer is more of an umbrella term. So especially for like the entire LGBTQ, so any identity that's not heterosexual generally is what I think of it as, and I may not identify as queer, but like I consider myself a part of that community. So kind of like umbrella terms, and then I feel things such as pansexual are more specific, like they mean one thing in particular, whereas queer and trans to me seem more like umbrella terms, which is kind of reflected in our office's naming as well.
yeah, and because the definitions or associations with these words change over time, it's always good to refer to the community at that particular point in time about what it means to them, or even that individual, because people's feelings about certain words can be different, So, yeah. All right. We're gonna quiz you at the end. Just kidding. You all are super attentive. It's kind of nerve-wracking. So queer is an umbrella term for different sexual and gender identities that are not heterosexual or cisgender. And cisgender is a term that means someone who identifies with the sex that they were assigned at birth. So if if you're born and then the doctor looked at your body and assigned you as male, and you grow up your entire life sharing with people that you're a male and that it doesn't feel uncomfortable for you to do that, then you might be characterized as cisgender. And then trans is an umbrella term, and that includes people who are whose gender identity is not consistent with their assigned sex. And so these are these here. Bigender, pangender, gender fluid, agender, those are words that exist within the trans umbrella. So it's kind of a little bit wordy, but basically someone who's trans doesn't identify with the sex that they were assigned at birth. So, yeah. Questions? Oh, okay, great.
Yeah.
A question, just an observation,
Sure.
while we're on acronyms. I learned a new one this week, which was AMAB and AFAB.
Yes.
I knew the phrases, but did not have not seen them abbreviated that way. So I saw a tweet and I had to go Google that. So that's assigned male at birth and assigned female at birth.
Yes.
You see those.
Wow, we have a hip crew. This is, AFAB and AMAB, so those are some of the terms that people use in the community. So if you hear someone sharing that, then that's, so they're, that's what they are, and yeah. Cool. Twitter is awesome.
All right, so just to touch a little bit on intersectionality. Intersectionality, basically, I think I want to summarize in quick words, is kind of like the overlapping of identities and how they can't really be separated from one another. So for example, I identify as a queer woman of color, and me being queer can't be separated from me being a person of color. So those things overlap and they impact the way I view things. Also, I really want to emphasize that gender identity and sexuality are separate from one another. So just because somebody, may be expressing themselves as, they may express more masculine, that doesn't mean that impacts the way their sexuality is or the way they orient themselves. So just any questions about that? I know it can be kind of difficult to understand. Yeah?
I've always thought I've heard intersectionality used more as like, don't throw another group under the bus to promote whatever your particular thing is. Is that a different use, or is that a nuance of the same thing, or?
It's super nuanced. Okay. And so for me, intersectionality means realizing that people don't exist one-dimensionally. So different aspects of their social identity impact their lived experience. So you can't necessarily speak about let's say queer oppression in a homogenistic way or homogenous way. You have to realize that that person's race might impact their lived experience, or their social class, or whether or not they have generational trauma. Like, those are things that impact that lived experience for that community. And so it's basically saying that there's a lot of things that influence the way that we experience the world. And so it stems from really the feminist movement and how feminism, particularly white feminism, failed in many ways to understand the nuanced experiences of Black women in the feminist movement. And so that's one historical reference that you can look to learn more. So,
I think you covered that really well.
Great. So pronouns and preferred names. As someone who's non-binary and trans, it's really important to get someone's names and pronouns correct. And I think that for me, the underlying assumption that one can make is, if you respect someone's pronouns, then you're respecting that person's humanity. You know what I mean? And so if someone misgenders you or uses the incorrect pronoun, it can really be, it can feel, disrespectful, or it can feel like the person doesn't see you for who you are. So it's really, I want to really reiterate that it's important to practice. If someone expresses a pronoun that you're not familiar with, or that is different than what you might assume, then it's good to practice and make sure that, if you make a mistake, then you quickly correct yourself. And that's a bigger conversation, but I just want to get that out there. And so there are real life implications to quote unquote dead naming someone or using the wrong pronouns. It can really, it's distracting. It can affect someone's mental health, and it's just it adds to an unhealthy work environment for someone. So.
And I think just one thing I want to add, I'm a cisgender person, and I think that if you do happen to dead name or misgender someone when you're using their pronouns, don't overwhelm that person with apologies, because sometimes that can be more, can impact their mental health a little bit more. Like, you're just trying to put it on them as opposed to yourself. You're not taking that responsibility. You're just like, I'm sorry, and you're waiting for them to say it's okay. So don't do that either. That's just a tip I like to give as, somebody who's not trans. So
Totally. Yeah. Great. Any questions?
Can you say what is a dead name?
Yeah, dead naming is a term that some people use in the trans and gender non-conforming community. Some people don't really vibe with it, but basically it's when you use a name that someone no longer identifies with. So say that I was born and my parents named me Joe, right? And then I realized 20 years down the road that I don't want to go by Joe. I want to go by Melinda. And then that I was Joe, or I was called Joe, and then you might call me Joe, even though I tell you I'm Melinda, So that's dead naming. And that happens, in face-to-face interactions. It can also happen over the internet, for example, if someone changes their preferred name on MyU, or I'm gonna mess this up a little bit, but basically, someone's dead name can show up on an email, even though they changed it in MyU. So.
there's another question maybe. Yeah.
Yeah, I know if someone, for example, puts something in an email, SIG as what their preferred pronoun is, that's made it really clear to me.
Yeah.
I should try to remember that and use that appropriately and so on. Melinda, do you feel as someone who identifies as trans and prefers the pronoun they, that the burden is on you to tell me the first time, and then the burden's on me to remember it after that? Or is the burden on me to ask your preference?
That's a great question. Yeah, and I think it's, creating an inclusive environment or like a really good healthy working relationship is a two-way street. And so for me, akin to what I said earlier, you can't tell what someone's pronouns are just by looking at them. So on the one hand, it's up to me to disclose that. And then on the other hand, it's up to the other individual to not make assumptions. So generally speaking, what I like to tell people or suggest is just don't make assumptions. So say, oh, Melinda, and just refer to them by their name, for example, or my coworker, or the person in the blue hat, until you actually get an affirmative about who that person is. Because I've certainly made a mistake of assuming someone was a certain identity just by the way that they looked, and it doesn't feel good, at least for me, to make that assumption and be wrong. So I hope did that answer your question? Yeah. Cool. All right.
All right, so some of these examples of gender-neutral pronouns, and there could be more, some people may not prefer these, so just examples, they, them, their, which I feel like you all have heard a little bit more, but just some examples. They are a conscientious student, that's their pen, and I know a lot of times people feel like that's not grammatically correct, but I think there are some problems with that, so just kind of disregard that if you keep thinking that. And then Z here, hears. And then Z is a conscientious student, and that's here. Have you all heard of these pronouns before? No?
Not the second step.
Yeah.
The second one. That one's a little bit, I don't know, do you have more familiarity with it?
No, but I do know that, it's a set of pronouns that's practiced not just in the U.S., but in other countries too. I feel like in I feel like Swedes use Z here, hears.
It's like a combination between she and he, so they like merged it together, and that's kind of what it came out to be.
And there's some really good practice tools on the interwebs too. I just discovered a game, for example. You could enter the pronoun, and then you have to fill in which version of that pronoun you use, and then you can't go to the next.
I love this.
Yeah, and then you can't go to the next question until you get it right. So there's good pressure. So I think there was another question.
Well, I just wanted, is that the same as they, them, their for a single person, or is this like an inclusive of everybody, regardless of gender identification?
Yeah, so it's just sometimes people prefer one or the other, so I wanted to put both up there. Like they're both commonly used as gender-neutral pronouns, so people can choose which one they prefer. If that answers your question, I don't.
Yeah, it's more like a self-identified thing. Yeah. Just want to reiterate that this is totally a primer, so there's much more room for learning, and we'll definitely send out more info about how to do this stuff. But yeah.
If somebody does prefer Z hears and you use them, is that offensive or just meh?
That's a good question. I think in the ideal world, it's best to use what they disclosed, and so it's really up to that person to determine whether that's offensive. I don't know. I don't use those pronouns, Do you have anything?
Yeah, exact same thing. I feel like it can go either way, because I know I've also heard, like, for example, with somebody being trans, like they prefer, or he prefers, I also did that, he, him, his pronouns, but then some people refer to him as they, them, theirs, and they don't like that. Like, he doesn't like that. So do you see how it can get confusing? But it doesn't matter what their pronouns are, just try to use those, because as you can see, even I can struggle sometimes, but to acknowledge that and move forward with it, that's important.
And I'll be sure to send out to Maya a workbook that I read when I was kind of in my learning, earlier in my learning curve. And it really, I would really recommend just going through it. It's called the Trans Ally Workbook. It's $5 online, or you can probably get a free one. So this question comes up a lot. People, I think for some it can be kind of awkward. I know it's just awkward to ask that because it's not really part of our regular discourse necessarily. And so here are just a few examples of how to ask people's names and pronouns. You can do it at an introductory go-around for your staff meetings. When someone's new to the department, you can give them like a note card for them to fill out. And then it's also important to remember that names and pronouns can shift over time. So to be transparent about how it's, people can update that information is good. I was working with someone at the Writing Center, and part of their practice is having folks fill out a Google form, for example, that they can revisit and edit, and then that so that people can know where people are with that.
And then where's that posted? If they're updating that Google form, like where is that information so that other staff
Totally.
can see that?
Yeah, I think it's up to the department to figure out. Some people, that the center that I'm talking about is a pretty small group, so for that setting, it's appropriate to have it posted, maybe for like the senior leadership or something, and everyone else to have in their office. But I think it just is up to the organization and the purpose of that list, right? Yeah. Any other questions?
All right, so I think we talked a lot about this a little earlier. I know you brought it up, the email signature. So this is definitely one way to normalize pronoun sharing, and just so that people can always be aware that you're open to knowing their pronouns, but also that they acknowledge that your identity exists and that they're using certain pronouns, so you can be aware of that as well. So really a good way to kind of get that out there right in the beginning and make everyone aware that you are an open and inclusive person.
All right. So these are just a few things to let people know or signal that you are on board and that you support them. You can display your pronouns. I know the Boynton staff, for example, one practice that they're trying to institute is having
buttons.
Yeah, those
They're
buttons.
Really cool.
Yeah, practitioners are like carrying around buttons with their pronouns, and that indicates or signals to someone coming in that they know what that means, and they're welcome to share that back. And then a key point is that we want to ask that you not out individuals. And so someone might share their pronouns with you, for example, or that they're trans with you. And it's important to ask them if they want that information just between you, or like if you want that information, if you want me to use those pronouns just in the workplace, and if I see you out in public, it's different. So there are a lot of things to consider, particularly because trans and gender nonconforming people experience higher rates of violence and discrimination, and so there are issues of safety and confidentiality to consider too. That's in a nutshell. There's a lot there, but just want to put that out there. Cool.
All right, so addressing inclusivity in the workplace. So we do have this statement up here, which was actually adapted from a syllabus, but just also something that you can put in your handbook policies. I can read it out loud. So we are firmly committed to respect and fairness in all areas of campus life, including members of the LGBTQIA+ community. We will work to promote an anti-discriminatory environment where everyone feels safe and welcome. We recognize that discrimination can be direct or indirect and take place at both institutional and personal levels. We believe that such discrimination is unacceptable, and we are committed to providing respect for all by eliminating any and all discrimination, harassment, bullying, or victimization. It's pretty self-explanatory, but I think it really puts a firm, it really emphasizes your support and makes it aware, like everyone aware that you are committed to their safety and their comfort. So, any questions with that?
All right. As I alluded to earlier, staff and faculty can set their preferred name, which will appear on class rosters, which is not necessarily relevant here, and email accounts. And you can also alert staff that you're bringing into the department that that's an option too. And this, this isn't necessarily just applicable to LGBTQIA students either, or people. Someone could simply like have a name that is mispronounced all the time, and so they need you to just use a different name.
Also, just no, actually, it doesn't update on your email account. People have to go in and manually do that. I don't know if you remember this, but yeah, we did actually have a meeting with somebody about this, and they have to go into their email and update their name. So if you know someone who is struggling with that, maybe that's something to make them aware about, just so that you can pass on that information, because I know a lot of people do struggle with their den names coming up and they don't know why, and it's because you and Gmail, like it's Gmail is a separate system, so yeah.
So if that ever comes up, you can always reach out to our office and we can help troubleshoot with that.
Yeah.
All right. What do we want? Well, these are some things that I want, and I've certainly heard other people express similar sentiments. An environment where people treat them with respect and take them seriously, and part of that means honoring their name, their self-disclosed name and pronouns. People who are humble and don't admit that they don't know everything and are open to learning. People who are compassionate and understanding about the experiences and stress that trans and gender nonconforming people face inside and outside of the workplace. And then also understanding and accepting that respecting us is non-negotiable. And unfortunately, that is not always the case. I was just reading an article about someone who was in kindergarten, and this notion of someone's identity or respecting it is negotiable was an issue for a kindergarten age student. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I think the last point again is super important. As a cisgender person, you can't just assume somebody's identity, and like really constantly emphasizing that you want to understand somebody's identity. Actually, you don't need to understand it, you need to just accept it, and I think that's super important. Because you're not going to understand everything, and you're not going to understand somebody else's experience, and you never will, but that's okay. Just accept that person. That's super important. And I did have a conversation with my professor once, and she was like, why, I don't understand why it matters to put it like, in a survey. And I said, it's literally just about respect. It has nothing more than that. You're showing that you accept that. It doesn't matter if you understand it or not. It matters that you accept that person.
Yeah. I really want to use this clicker.
Yeah.
All right, scenario. Is it my turn?
No. Yeah. So one of your colleagues keeps misgendering another colleague in front of others. How do you address the situation? And I think it would be fine if you all took a couple minutes just to talk amongst the people around you, and then we can come back to the big group and share if that works. Right.
If you need help finding a partner, or you can come to me, we can be partners. I'm an introvert, so it can get
I mean, like,
I'm imagining it sort of the, yeah, no, if they were there, I think
All right.
If you can raise the roof if you're done. Raise the roof. Nice. Awesome. All right.
If we could all get back into the big group, that'd be really great.
Cool.
So does anyone want to share what things came up? So, anyone, feel free to raise your hand and chime in. Were you struggling with it? Did you come up with a good solution? Yeah.
So, we agreed that what we would do is take aside one-on-one the person who is misgendering our colleague and say, you know, I've noticed that you're doing this, and you may not be aware that so-and-so prefers to be called Y, and, you know, please try to be sensitive to that in future, and thought it would be better to do it one-on-one at the start rather than in front of the group, because it is a learning area for many of us. And then if the person continued to do it, probably tell them that if they continue to do it, we'd raise it with HR.
All right, Rich, what do you think about that?
Then I'll have the same conversation.
Okay. Yeah.
Well, I was gonna say, we don't know about this unit, and so for us, one of the key, we agreed with, we said the same thing, but then keeps misgendering another colleague, which implies that no one else is stopping it, which means maybe there's not a good office culture.
Yeah.
Well, it's not maybe just that one person.
It's a bigger question.
Maybe just a matter of, giving the person the benefit of the doubt. Maybe they just don't know. I think that would be one thing you'd want to find out. And then also, I think that part of that is, I know they're misgendering, but that means I know something about that other person. Maybe that's not public knowledge.
Which brings me to the point of, if I were in this situation, typically, and I have been, typically what I do is I pull that person aside who's being misgendered, and ask them, hey, I noticed this happened, like, what is there anything you would like me to do? I'm happy to pull that person aside, or, in the future I can interrupt the conversation and, casually correct them or whatever. But I like to leave it up to the person who's being misgendered to determine how they would like to go forward with it. Would you ask?
Yeah, and I think something similar. I've talked to friends before who, like, when they first told me about their identity, I just asked them what they prefer for me to do in the future, just so that I'm aware. Because a lot of times people may identify in a certain way in front of you, but somebody else you don't know. So, like, just always ask that person first, and if they have given you the okay, then I think it's, like you said, do the one-on-one, intervene with the person one-on-one. I think that is the best way, just because you're reducing embarrassment for everyone. More importantly, the person who's being misgendered.
So this raises an interesting question. If somebody confides in you their pronouns, but we are not to assume that everybody knows that, and we're in a meeting, but we don't know if they've talked to everybody in that meeting. Is this another thing that we should clarify up front, which is, do you want me to use these pronouns in a group setting or just when we're one-on-one?
Yeah, and I think definitely that's something to clarify up front. And again, because you don't want to out that person in a group meeting, that would be really problematic if they haven't come out. So yeah, I think that's a good point to bring up. Yeah.
If it's used in an email footer, is it safe to assume it's public?
I would say so.
Yeah.
Yeah, as somebody who has my pronouns in my email. Communication's great, so if you're like unsure, it's good to check in. I also want to reiterate that it's totally a learning curve to like figure out all the different situations that, pronouns are important and names are important, and you're like, oh gosh, what am I supposed to use in this situation versus when I see them at the restaurant, so rest assured, we have the rest of our lives to like get good at this. So, yeah. And so this is a little bit that I wrote about specific to social research and data, since we're in the ISRDI. I practiced. You all have probably filled out a bunch of applications, filled out surveys, and oftentimes you might have noticed that people collect data along a very strict binary of female and male. So I just wanted to articulate how that is a thing that impacts trans and gender nonconforming people. There's a few recommendations that I bring forth, partly in my work in this role, partly just because I'm trans and gender nonconforming and I've been on the receiving end or responded, and then partly because I'm also a part of the Trans Advisory and Action Team, and we came up with a list of recommendations for collecting data on this population. We recommend to critically examine if asking about sex and gender on a document is really needed, and if so, be transparent about why it's needed. So if it's for reporting for grant purposes, then state that. If it's for a federal requirement, then say so. Where are you collecting this information? Consider who might be excluded in your choice of data collection method. So if you're collecting information through a survey method, email survey, just recognize that, you all probably know about this, but just recognize that some people, particularly homeless people, might not have access to email, and that's particularly true for trans people, trans youth. And then what information are you collecting? Make sure that it's relevant to the community and be clear about what you're collecting and why. So some people might ask a question like, I hope this isn't going to overwhelm me, but someone might ask, are you a male, female, cisgender male, trans male, trans female? And for someone who's trans, as a trans woman, they might say, well, why do you have female and trans female? Like, I'm a female. Like, the trans is, not an issue here. So that's where that last bullet point comes from.
Also, I'm sure you know not to do this, but I have heard of people going in and changing somebody's male or female marker because they know that person's biological sex. Definitely don't do that. That's especially without telling the person, that's really awful. And I have known somebody to do that, and I couldn't do anything about the situation, so always keep that in mind.
Yeah, totally. Thank you.
Yeah.
This is just a little bit of a pushback against what
Sure.
you just said, which is, in general, I think another parallel would be like, well, why do you ask about race on the census? And, we should be a race-blind society. Why are we making people report this over and over again? Or sex, you could say the same thing. And the reason, or I think a good reason to collect the data is because the only way you can track discrimination and inequality is if you have data on it. And again, if I think the reason that people may specifically say, have a question or a category, are you trans, X-gender, rather than just, are you, I mean, maybe we could have cis and trans, though I think a lot of people are not going to know what cis means.
Totally.
Is if you are looking at things like discrimination or health disparities or whatever for the trans or LGBTQ population, you can't track it if you don't ask it.
Yeah, that's a really good point, and I think that that's a question that comes up a lot around collecting data on quote-unquote underrepresented communities or marginalized communities. Something that I should have prefaced this with is that, oftentimes underrepresented communities are over-tapped, as you know, for information. And also, we come up against this thing where people ask us for information about ourselves, and we don't know why, And so the general idea that I have from the trans and gender nonconforming community is that, we don't want to share it unless there's a legitimate reason, right? And if there is a legitimate reason, then be clear about that, be transparent about that, and have it be optional. And of course, we're we operate within this structure where we have reporting mandates, for example, for the federal government, I forget the legislation, but so in those cases, it's you can be transparent about that. But I think it's really just up to the community to determine what is a legitimate reason. And there are some people in the trans and gender nonconforming community who don't see value in having data about their identity be collected. And some people do, right? And so that's where having the option matters. And similar to how, like, you know, you're not required to answer on race or ethnicity, you know, like it's parallel, right? So, yeah.
I might also suggest, right, as we're an office that thinks a lot about data collection and research possibilities, that from creating a culture in the office, I think reasons for asking within the institute are very different than census revamping the way they collect that information for like broad scale nationally representative research. But the way that we choose to collect information within MPC and ISDRI.
Nice. You got it.
I think that those are different, and I think our awareness as a group about that on federal surveys might be very different than how we choose to talk about that within our office.
Totally. Yeah, context definitely matters for, you know, why we're collecting that information. So this is a huge conversation that I wish I could talk more about. I'm actually doing a presentation on it tomorrow morning for the data deep dive, something or other. But yeah, if you want to talk about it more, about collecting data on trans and gender nonconforming people more, definitely feel free to reach out to me. You know, I work in this capacity as assistant director to the Gender and Sexuality Center for Queer and Trans Life. I'm by no means like the representative person for the entire trans and gender nonconforming community. But, you know, I do interface a lot with trans and gender nonconforming people who, you know, wherein this topic matters. So. Yeah.
Right. I think some more important points about how you can like be more inclusive, even if you're not including a certain population. So if you're presenting material which presents heterosexuality or cisgender bodies as the invisible norm, address this unspoken bias. So I did have a instructor in a class who was presenting, you know, information on romantic relationships, but only had heterosexual couples. So his way of kind of balancing that was to say, I realize that this research only discusses heterosexual couples, but since this data is important to the study of relationships, you know, we will be conducting it as such. So kind of emphasizing like why you're still doing it even if it's not being fully inclusive it is helpful, just because you're showing that you are aware of it, and I think that's super important. And then also acknowledging when something happens that may impact trans and gender nonconforming individuals, whether it's in or outside of the workplace. So, for example, with the bathroom bill, just, you know, letting colleagues know where the closest accessible bathrooms are. So even something like that can like really help show your support. Yeah. You have anything to add to that?
That's perfect.
Cool.
And then I think this is one of our final slides, but hearing feedback is important. So generally it's good to provide an avenue for staff to give feedback about how to make this space more welcoming. So having that opportunity, providing that opportunity, and maybe soliciting this final question, you know, if you were in charge, what would you change?
And then thinking bigger, pushing for departmental change. So I think it's great that you're all here, because that really shows your commitment as a center to, you know, change your way of being inclusive. So trying to always think about what's the culture like in your department for trans and gender nonconforming people and social justice issues, and what can you do to institutionalize this type of support. So you all being here, that's definitely one way of you showing that you're trying to learn more, and, you know, it's a process, like things take a lot of time. So this is like one step in that, but what are you gonna do, you know, maybe bigger on in the university? How are you gonna push for these changes? That's something to constantly think about.
Totally. Thank you for coming. Please feel free to talk to either of us. No. Thank you. So it looks like we have about 7 minutes. Maybe we can just take questions until the end. Yeah.
Can you define generational trauma?
Oh, sure. Generational trauma is this notion that people who have experienced violence in their lineage carry that forward into future generations. So, you know, an example, right? I'm a first generations person. My parents immigrated from Cambodia in the 80s from the Khmer Rouge, which was the genocide that happened there. And so you could say that I experienced generational trauma from that that experience, that even though it happened, and even though I didn't physically interface with that violence, the trauma from that travels across generations. Sure.
Can you speak a little bit about initiatives that are happening at larger university? One thing I think about a lot is that I guess a couple of years ago now, there was the designation of some restrooms as unisex. But the reality is the two sets of restrooms that are close to us are both still gendered.
Mm-hmm.
And it feels like we could do more there as a university. Are there initiatives like that your office is involved in working on right now, or other offices that you
Yes.
align with?
You can start. Yeah.
So actually, the Trans Advisory and Action Team, which I mentioned earlier, we've been on a couple-year process of creating a university-wide trans and gender nonconforming equity policy, and so we're finally going through the process of actualizing that and hopefully having it be adopted by the university by the end of the academic year. So right now we're doing consultations with different Senate committees and other campuses to make that happen. So keep that in mind. That will it is definitely something in the works. And then in terms of departmental change and this having gendered restrooms and that's it in this building, that's really more of a leadership or just like a organizational culture conversation. Like, if this is something that we care about, how do we allocate funding? How do we make it possible fiscally to actualize it? So, yeah.
Do you have recommendations for, I volunteer at a mental health center.
Sure.
The intake form says male, female. Do you have recommendations for what should be in that kind of when you're looking at that kind of data? What categories or terminology should be included?
Yes.
It's like a growing list. So, and we can actually send that out if that's something you're looking for. We have pretty good examples of that, but I generally what I'll see is like, people still feel the need to put male, female, but you could put something like man, woman, so it's just gender and not sex. Some people put gender queer, gender fluid, non-binary. It's really like, it's nice to have that expansive list, but it's also up to your room. So I don't know what your thoughts are on it. I've seen variations of it, so.
So the TAT, I'm just going to refer to it as TAT now, the Trans Advisory and Action Team, they came out with a long and short version of recommendations on collecting data. And so our ideal is that we have an open-ended question that says gender identity, blank, right? There are some instances where that's not possible. So then we recommend, I could send it out, but I think it's female, male, and then trans, and then another identity. So that's the other thing. Yeah.
Just one that's come up at a lot of the user interface conferences I've been to is a lot of times that question is asked and nobody needs to know. At a mental health place, it doesn't matter if you're a boy or a girl, so just don't ask.
That's a good point.
Yeah, I'm seeing, as somebody who does some research into disparities between straight and LGBTQ population, for me it was like, wow, this is really great that some federal surveys are starting to add questions about gender identity and sexual orientation. So the National health interview survey for very, very recently for the first time, even though it's been collecting data for 50 years, added a question on that, or a question that came up for a possibility for inclusion in the 2020 census was one on gender and sexual identity.
Yeah.
And so, you know, it's interesting to me to hear sort of some pushback from you about that, because my perspective is all like, there's no information about this. We know there are disparities on the basis of unrepresentative surveys and snowball surveys and focus groups and so on, but we really need, you know, nationally representative data to have good policy and make, you know, strong statements about needs of this community. And I just wonder, like, it seems like there's sort of, we're coming from different directions. I just wonder if you can comment on that.
Totally. I think there's like there are people who really love that that's happening, and there are people that don't. And I can speak to a little bit of why some people don't. You know, some people, because of their background, maybe they're undocumented, maybe they had you know, not the best experiences with the government or the police. You know, they might be wary about information being collected by the census, for example, because that information, based on their life experience, might influence them to not trust that data to be respected, right? So that's one kind of thing that I'm thinking about. And yeah, I don't know. I think it's hard because I guess I don't really want to talk about the trans and gender nonconforming or the community or the larger queer community in like this clear-cut way, because I mean our like the fundamental theme about queer and trans communities is like spectrum and fluidity and variability, and so I think my hope is just to bring that nuance, more of that nuance, into the conversation.
Yeah, and I think as somebody who wants to go into psychology research on the LGBTQIA community, I think a lot of it is like your intention and what you plan to do with that. Especially like confidentiality is a big thing, so a lot of times people aren't out to their families, and you know, if that information somehow gets out, that's going to be really traumatic for them. So really just enforcing like that confidentiality piece, and also really explaining why you're wanting to do that. So yeah.
One other thing that I wanted to mention too is that, you know, sometimes we talk really confidently about like people's identities, and that they like know what their pronouns are and what their names are and like where they are in their gender identity. But some people are totally still figuring that out, you know. And so I just want to make space for that too, and that's a real reality. Yeah.
Are there, I'm just, as we're thinking about kind of institutionally what we can do to be more supportive, are there things that are already happening that you're involved with that we can just hop on board with and ride that wave and support?
Nice.
Well, a little bit. Last summer, this past summer, I've been going around to departments and talking to them about what their policies are for trans and gender nonconforming students. So kind of you get a lot of learning from that. So I think even kind of doing that kind of research, just figuring out what is happening around campus is just really helpful. Like even asking departments near you, you know, or buildings on West Bank, like what are they doing? Because we're on East Bank. So things like that, I think even as little as that can help. So that's kind of what we've been doing. And not really conclusive because everyone's at different places still, and I think that says a lot about the communication between the entire universe.
Yeah, totally. You could do a quote unquote audit of your department. Like, you start with forms, for example. Like, how are our forms invisibilizing the trans and gender nonconforming community? Or, you know, I think it's the Minnesota AIDS Project recently asked the board of directors to put their pronouns on their name tags, you know, as a general practice, and so those are other institutional things that you can do. So. Thank you all for being so.